a big welcome to everyone. It looks like we're getting 17 so far, so pretty much the same numbers as last week. I expect maybe a couple more. I see a couple of different names from last week, so welcome if you weren't with us last week, and welcome back to everyone that was. I just wanted to give a little heads up about what we're going to do next week for session 3. It will be a little different. We'll be meeting in the church at St. Aidan's at 6:30. Peter Latoux is making us a wonderful soup-based meal. And then we'll probably have a lot of fun in Whitehall for about 45 minutes or so, and then migrate over to the church, where we'll do what we've done in the past is sort of a hybrid presentation. We'll be live in the church, and we'll also be on Zoom. So if you don't feel like you can come out and join us in person, we will be live at Zoom at 7:30. I guess Lisa will send out the link again in case you didn't save it from this week. And that's pretty much it. So we're looking forward to seeing everybody in person and doing round 3 with LJ. And that's it for me. Peg, do you want to do the formal kickoff for this session?
I'll do the formal kickoff. Anyway, everybody here most people know LJ from last week. If you don't know, LJ is the Director of Faith Formation at St. Matthew's Cathedral in Washington, D.C. He's also a deep student of the mystics, and he's been doing this series for us for some time now. And so this is our second session on Theresa of Avila, and we're all looking forward to it. And he's going to have some good recommendations for us. So welcome, everybody.
Hi, everybody. Let's get started, shall we? Let me just share my screen here. Okay. There we go. Theresa of Avila, or as we were calling her last week, Terry. I encourage you to call her Terry. I think she would like that. She was an earthy, fierce, and most of all, very grounded mystic. And you're going to hear a lot about that tonight. But let's start with prayer, which is, of course, the one thing she wants to tell you about. So I invite you just to close your eyes and listen. And then we're going to have some time for no pensar nada, or thinking nothing. This is the slide for thinking nothing. So we'll get there. But let's listen to Theresa's most famous prayer, her bookmark. Let nothing disturb you. Let nothing frighten you. All things are passing. God only is changeless. Patience gains all things. Who has God wants nothing. God alone suffices. You recall Theresa practiced no pensar nada, which for her meant to be blind, deaf, and mute within, not looking at, listening to, or talking to your thoughts, but to simply be in dark faith, absorbed in God. So I invite you now to just close your eyes, take a deep breath, and stop thinking for a moment, just to be with God. And one more big, deep breath. And when you're ready, open your eyes. Amen. Let's go back to something we talked about last week. This is what she writes in her book, Her Life. I repeat, let no one who has cultivated the practice of contemplative prayer grow discouraged and say, I end up reverting to my old ways, it would be better for me to give up prayer altogether. I believe things will get worse if the person abandons prayer and refuses to quit his bad habits. But if he stays the course, prayer will carry him into the harbor of light. So remember from last week, Terry was a person of prayer, and one of the main messages of her book, her life, the life that she wrote, was to never stop praying and never give up praying, specifically the kind of prayer we just did. Yes, it might be surrounded by some words, some time in nature or books, but the heart of prayer for Theresa of Avila was that no pensar nada. It was the contemplative prayer of just being with God in silence. So prayer is her main teaching. And we're going to talk more about prayer this evening. We're going to talk about what prayer looks like in a busy life. So we're going to look at one of, actually, I'm going to call it's the most underrated book by Terry, The Foundations. You're looking at a picture of modern day Avila. And this is where it all began for Theresa. She, at the end of the book of her life, she narrates the founding of the first Reform Carmelite convent called St. Joseph's in Avila. She, remember, was a Carmelite nun, but she was living in this very large nunnery in Avila, but it was called the Incarnation. And then she, under the inspiration of the Spirit and in conversation with a small group of sisters, of Carmelite sisters, they wanted to go back to the original intent of the Carmelites. Originally founded as a male movement, they were hermits on Mount Carmel during the Crusades. They were a contemplative order dedicated to solitude and prayer, solitude and contemplation. And they had grown far from that by the time, and this was in the 1200s that they were founded. By the 1500s, they had kind of grown a little far from that original purpose. So Terry goes back to it, and she found St. Joseph's in Avila. Well, it didn't stop there. I highly recommend, before we get into the foundations, I highly recommend this book. There's only one translation. Well, actually, there's two. There's a much older translation by E. Allison Piers. He was one of the very first translators of these Spanish mystics. But the most recent and more updated versions of all of Terry's works come from Kieran Kavanagh and Otilio Rodriguez. There are some really good translations by Mirabai Starr, but the Foundations is only in the Kavanagh translation. But this book is a study guide, and Mark Foley is the commentator. So you have the whole book of the Foundations plus commentary from a Carmelite friar named Mark Foley. He lives here in DC. He's fantastic. And it's a fantastic book. And even he admits, as he introduces the commentary, I didn't want to read this one. This seemed like boring history, but it wasn't. So let's look at what Mark has to say. The Foundations is much more than a chronicle of the establishment of convents. It is a record of how Theresa practiced the virtues she wrote of in her other works: charity, detachment, humility, patience. St. Paul rightly ranks patience as the foremost characteristic of love. For authentic love requires perseverance and a firm resolution to embrace the cross with a determined determination. So that's a quote from The Way of Perfection, we're also going to talk about tonight. But determined determination is a classic Theresian theme. I've already heard it. The whole theme of her, the book of her life is don't stop praying. Pray with a determined determination. So this is something that she applies across all of her works. The Foundations could be subtitled The Spirituality of the Long Haul. It chronicles 15 long, grueling years from 1567 to 1582, during which Theresa endured numerous trials in the process of founding 17 convents, 15 which she founded personally and 2 others under her direction. Theresa finished writing the foundations toward the end of June 1582, and almost as if she knew that she had completed all the work the Lord had assigned to her, she died 4 months later, October 4th, 1582. Excuse me. In 1571, after founding 8 monasteries of nuns, St. Joseph's in Avila, again, that's the first one, the one at the end of the book of her life. Medina del Campo, 1567, Malagon, 1568, Valladolid, 1568, Toledo, 1569, Pastrana, 1569. Look at those, very closely together, 2 a year. Salamanca and Alba de Tormes. St. Teresa was then, after founding all those, the powers that be, the Carmelite superiors were like, we have to rein this lady in. So she was ordered to return to the Incarnation in Avila to be the prioress. And it said that when she got there, because these are the nuns that she initially left, and was almost like a critique of their way of life, founding this other convent in the same exact city, Avila. They literally barred the doors. They put stuff against the doors to keep Teresa out. They did not want her. She wound up making it a much more holy monastery of women at the end, though. Undaunted and one step ahead of her foes, as usual, there were no men who could match her. I'm not exaggerating here. She would go through confessor after confessor and priest after priest. She challenged them. There were only 2 men that challenged her back, and she could never kind of get one over on. Not that she was trying to, but met her as equals, and they were saints. St. John of the Cross, who was about 20 years her junior, and St. Peter of Alcantara, who was probably 20 years her senior. St. Peter helped found the very first one, and St. John of the Cross, he'll play a part later this evening. But she writes to King Philip and obtains permission, and then she's on the road again. So Terry knew who to contact. So 1573 is where the story begins, but she's chronicling what it was like founding these Carmelite convents. And this here is the Monastery of the Incarnation, where she grew up as a nun. This is where she had those very amazing mystical experiences, like the transverberation, the angel piercing her heart with an arrow. This is where she was hatched the idea to reform Carmel. This was her mother. This was her home, right? This was the convent she initially entered. This is the one that wound up having about 200 nuns there. And of course, today she's honored there. But it's at the Incarnation that she comes to the prayer of union. So you might recall from last week, there are 4 types of prayer. And the last one that she calls it the prayer of union. This is the one that she's in. So she's in a deep state of prayer. So just to refresh you from last week from the life, the Lord spoke to me, the soul utterly dissolves in this state of prayer so that it can fully unite with me, God said to her. It is no longer the soul that lives, but I, which is a reference to Galatians. Teresa writes, all I can say is that the soul sees herself as one with God. And then she writes, almost without knowing she is doing it, the soul begins to benefit her neighbors. The fragrance of her flowers has grown so sweet that other souls are attracted to her. They recognize her virtue and want to partake in the holy feast. Few souls reach this state without having suffered innumerable misunderstandings, criticisms, and illnesses. During these trials, but these trials cultivate the soil of the soul. Detachment from self-interest softens the earth, allowing the water to penetrate it so thoroughly that it almost never becomes arid again. So what is important about this section is the only thing in this world that is truly effective is holiness. Teresa did not intend from the first moment she set foot in the Incarnation to found a whole new branch of the Carmelites. So they eventually become a whole new religious order. And today there are the Carmelites of the ancient observance and the Discalced Carmelites, and that's Theresa's group. She never meant to do that. But as she grew in holiness, as she grew closer to God in prayer, she, as you can tell, the fragrance of her flowers becomes attractive. She becomes attractive to her neighbor. So other women in the monastery start gathering around Theresa, and they go, you know what, we want to be like you. We want to live more deeply like you. We can't do it at the incarnation. We need a new place. So this happens. It kind of like it has a momentum all its own, but it's really arising from Theresa's own personal journey of holiness. Here is St. Joseph's in Avila, the monastery that Theresa founded. And Foley writes, St. Theresa grew in holiness not in spite of obstacles, such as being entangled in lawsuits, mired down in disputes over dowries, tied up in interminable bureaucratic red tape, involved in the political infighting of the church, and having to deal with unscrupulous businessmen. But because of these difficulties, all of these challenges set up roadblocks to the establishment of Theresa's foundations, but none of them impeded her spiritual growth. Quite the contrary, they were the trials through which she triumphed. It was a headache, to say the least, for Theresa to found this Carmelite convent in Avila. There were innumerable difficulties. They had to do it in the middle of the night when no one was watching. But once they did it, it was all set. And she thought it might just be this one, just 12 nuns as opposed to 150 in the incarnation that grew to 200. Well, let's just keep it at 12 and I'll be one of them. Nope, God says, I want you to found more. One of the first ones she goes to found is in the city of Medina del Campo. And I wanted to give this to you as a case study, because she'll write about these different foundations and to get an idea of what she had to deal with, in addition to what Foley writes here. So lawsuits, disputes over dowries. Dowries, you know, where it's like a package deal maybe of goods and resources that were given along with a daughter, either to a convent or to a husband. Bureaucratic red tape. There's no shortage of that, even in 16th century Spain. The politics of the church, bad businessmen. Also, when she goes to Medina del Campo or Toledo or Pastrana or Salamanca, anywhere, she has to get permission from the bishop and from the people of the city, usually in the form of a mayor or some elected official. She has to find a house for these sisters and eventually friars to stay. She has to negotiate contracts over property. And meanwhile, she has to secure vocations. Where are the sisters coming from? That actually appeared to be the easy part. It appeared that there were always women coming to her, but she still had to meet with them and maybe meet with their families. So like I say here in the fifth bullet point, meetings. Terry couldn't escape meetings, and often delayed meetings. She had to travel. She had to commute to and from all of these cities. We're going to have a great little story about her travels to Burgos in a few moments. She had to deal with intense criticism over these monasteries because she wanted them to be poor. A lot of monasteries would, other religious houses would take a patron. So a rich person would just kind of promise to fund the monastery to keep it going. Theresa just said, no, we're going to live only on alms from what the people of the city deign to give us. And all this, she often has to ask for innumerable people to help her. Often it's rich, devout women of the city, and it's a lot of priests that she needs help from, especially the recently founded group known as the Jesuits. But she still manages to fit in a little teaching about prayer in chapter 5. So let's go through that quickly. She writes, the soul is not the mind, nor is the will directed by thinking, for this would be very unfortunate. Hence, the soul's progress does not lie in thinking much, but in loving much. Okay, so prayer, as we said last week, is about an intense friendship with God. It's communion. It's the silence of not thinking, but it's really about love. It's about loving God. She's very aware in this chapter of subtle self-love. That proves to be a major obstacle to union with God. She has a little prayer here. O Lord, how different are your paths from our clumsy imaginings, and how from a soul that is already determined and is abandoned into your hands, you do not want anything but that it obey, that it inquire well into what is for your greater service, and that it desire this. There is no need for it to be seeking out paths or choosing them, for its will is yours. You, my Lord, take up this care of guiding it to where it receives the most benefit. She writes this prayer, and this might be a little wordy, but it's a prayer of someone who's out in the world doing something. She is out in the world and she's experiencing God's confirmation. Terry, go found a monastery in Toledo. And then she goes, really, Toledo? I don't think that's not a good place. There are all these reasons why this is not a good idea. And God more forcefully tells her, no, go there and do this. And it's her abandonment that helps her obedience that helps her carry it out. And then once she puts her mind to it, she's like, it's going to happen. I don't know how it's going to happen, but it's going to happen. She writes about people of prayer. In prayer, they find all the happiness that could be wanted in this life. See, this is where Terry's rooted. This is why the criticism of the people of a particular city or the anger of a bishop over this group of nuns, none of this deterred her in the slightest. None of it really affected her because her happiness was rooted in God. For in desiring nothing, they, people of prayer, possess all. Nothing on earth do they fear or desire. Neither do trials disturb them, nor do consolations move them. In sum, nothing can take away their peace, because these souls depend only on God. And since no one can take him away from them, only the fear of losing him can cause them pain. Everything else in this world, in their opinion, is as though it were not. It neither contributes anything nor removes anything from their happiness. That's a person of prayer. The highest perfection obviously does not consist in interior delights or in great raptures or in visions or in the spirit of prophecy. All these experiences, by the way, she has had. So she can kind of be the authority here. Perfection is not found in them, but in having our will so much in conformity with God's will, that there is nothing we know he wills that we do not want with all our desire. Meaning, I want what God wants. My will is God's will. And in accepting the bitter as happily as we do the delightful, when we know that his majesty desires it. She has this wonderful phrase in the middle of the chapter, be alone enjoying you, meaning in solitude enjoying God alone. And I just wanted to highlight these two words, God alone. That might be a really good summary in 2 words of Theresa of Avila, John of the Cross, Therese of Lisieux, the whole Carmelite tradition. God alone. Finally, she writes in chapter 5, it's necessary to be on one's guard and careful in the performance of good works by having frequent interior recourse to God, even though these works are done in obedience and charity. So here's our first principle for an active mystical life. That is a mystic in action, mystic in daily life, has to stop and pray often, right in the middle of whatever it is you're doing. Now, I don't think this means you get on your knees, you're driving down 495 and you just stop the car, and you get out on the side of the road and on the shoulder there and you get on your knees. No, nothing incredibly formal, something brief. Even as you're driving, help me, God, or thank you, God, or I praise you, God, that person nearly missed me and didn't hit me. Something Simple. In that regard, I might recommend to you Brother Lawrence of the Resurrection, who was another Carmelite, a really faithful son, spiritual son of Theresa of Avila. So continuing to pray even while you're working, while you're active, that's really key for Theresa. So she's found in Medina del Campo, and while she's in Medina del Campo, she meets two friars who also want a reform. And one of them is a young man still studying for the priesthood named Juan de los Martires, and he eventually becomes St. John of the Cross. And there he is. He and another Carmelite friar, Antonio, found the first reform monastery for the men in Duruelo. And even though that's a picture of Duruelo, it was a barn. It was a ramshackle, nearly falling down little barn. It was incredibly poor. And here is Theresa. She had already sent them out there, and she pays her first visit. And this is what she writes. When I arrived in the morning, Father Fray Antonio was sweeping the doorway to the church with that joyful expression on his face that he always has. I said to him, "What's this, my father? What has become of your honor?" Telling me of his great happiness, he answered with these words, "I curse the day I had him." When I entered the little church, I was astonished to see the spirit the Lord had put there. There were so many crosses, so many skulls. Hang on to that. I never forget a little cross made for the holy water fount from sticks with a paper image of Christ attached to it. It inspired more devotion than if it had been something very expertly carved. The choir was in the loft. In the middle of the loft, the ceiling was high enough to allow for the recitation of the hours, but one had to stoop low in order to enter and hear mass. There were in the two corners facing the church, two little hermitages, where one could do no more than either lie down or sit. Both were filled with hay because the place was very cold, and the roof almost touched one's head. Each had a little window facing the altar and a stone for a pillow, and there too, the crosses and skulls. I learned that after the friars finished matins, they did not leave the choir before prime, but remained there in prayer. For their prayer was so deep that when it came time to say prime, their habits were covered with snow without their having become aware of the fact. This is Theresa's vision for the men and the women of the Reform. People so absorbed in prayer, they're not really as drawn into what happens to their bodies or their senses, even though they still do. But I think it's kind of cute that their habits were covered with snow because they had been in prayer for so long. I also think, man, that sounds really cold. And then there's Burgos. Oh, Terry had a time at Burgos. So here's modern day Burgos. Not a great experience. She writes, there was cold weather and snow at the time. That which daunted me most was my lack of health. This lack of health was what very often tired me out. The cold was not bad. Within a few days, they brought me the license along with letters urging me to hurry. At that time, the Order of the Victorines came there to make a foundation, and the Cales Carmelite friars were there for a long time trying to make a foundation. Afterwards, the Basilians came. That so many of us had come together at the same time was a great obstacle and something to keep in mind. So in other words, Burgos was a popular place, and there were a lot of religious groups trying to get a house established there and almost in competition with Theresa's nuns. So I got to go to Burgos, okay? So on her way, this is what happens. The roads were so flooded from the heavy rains. True, our Lord told me, right? She gets confirmation from God throughout. Our Lord told me that we could go without harm, that I should not fear, that he would be with us. Still, there was a special danger in a river crossing near Burgos called Paso de los Pontes. The rain had been so heavy and had lasted so long that the water flooded the bridge. As a result, the bridge could not be seen, nor could we see where to pass. All was water, and everywhere it was very deep. In some, it was a great imprudence to cross there, especially with wagons, for just by veering a little from the course, all would have been lost. And in fact, one of her wagons almost was entirely lost. She also writes, I was making the journey with a severe sore throat, which I caught on my way to Valladolid. Along with a fever that had not left, eating was very painful. This prevented me from enjoying the good things that happened during the journey. This illness has remained with me until now, the end of June, although considerably less severe, but still very painful. So, Terry's not having a good time. And you can see what she had to deal with. I like this chapter very much because guess what? Mystics still catch cold. They still get fevers and have sore throats, and they still have a hell of a time trying to get somewhere sometimes. You could think maybe if you had to travel at all this past week in the snow. What carries her through it, the very end of this slide, the very bottom there, trust and patience. Trust and patience. She experienced God say to her, you're going to be fine. You're going to be fine. Don't worry. There's nothing to fear. Trust in me and be patient. Basically, patience is trust carried throughout all these different experiences of illness and anxiety over the foundation and all the competition that could be there and the water and not just the water, but after the rains pass, there's the mud. It's like one thing after another here at Burgos, but it does eventually result in a new convent. It also gives rise to this little tale. The current of a river almost carried away Teresa's wagon. It was this event that gave rise to the story that as Teresa began to complain to God, she heard a voice from heaven saying, my daughter, don't you know that this is how I treat my friends? And Teresa responded, yes, my Lord, I know. That is why you have so few. She's lovely, isn't she? Now, we don't actually have a record of her saying that, but that's this story about Burgos kind of gave rise to this little legend and this picture of her falling off a horse into the mud going, oh my God, I love you so much, but why do you treat your friends like this? And that brings us to kind of a little bridge between the foundations and the way of perfection. And that you'll find it in all of her writings. Terry has wit. I just wanted to bring up a few little choice nuggets that she says, just to get you a little bit into her wit. I apologize for the poor quality of this picture, but this is a good example. Our body has this defect that the more it is provided care and comforts, the more needs and desires it finds. That's a witty way to put it, but it's also just kind of true. And man, did she just kind of predict our consumer culture, didn't she? But even better than this one. From heaven, even the most miserable life will look like one bad night at an inconvenient hotel. She must have been a hoot to be around, really. Let there be no disappointment when obedience keeps you busy in outward tasks. If it sends you to the kitchen, remember that the Lord walks among the pots and pans. That's a good one because I don't want to do dishes, much less take out the garbage. But Terry says, nope, that's what obedience demands. God's going to be there with you. Or this one, I do not fear Satan half as much as I fear those who fear him. Even in those days, there was a great concern over fundamentalist, like kind of almost fanatical Christians who were overly concerned about the devil and not even really giving their attention to God. Terry, you're so funny. From silly devotions and from sour-faced saints, good Lord, deliver us. Again, there's a reason why. Let me go back here. This is my favorite picture of her because you can see that it's a painting. It's raining and her horse is looking at her from the horse pulling the wagon, and she's probably in the mud. and yet she's smiling. And that's a saint right there. That's a mystic right there. Because she says the person of prayer, right, to go back just a few slides, let's go back just a few slides here. The person of prayer, they're depending on God alone. Criticism, bad experiences, those don't matter. Nothing can take away their peace because they depend on God alone. And the last one, God is even kinder than you think. And what a lovely, first of all, this is tremendously gospel and tremendously theologically important. But I've never heard it put like that God is kinder than you think. But this is what undergirds her teaching on prayer. And we come back to that with the Way of Perfection. So the Way of Perfection was a handbook on prayer written for the nuns of her reform movement and eventually also the friars. So represent the Lord himself as close to you, and behold how lovingly and humbly he is teaching you. Believe me, you should remain with so good a friend as long as you can. She wants us just to look at Christ, who is always present to us and gazing on us with love. Well now, daughters, your spouse never takes his eyes off you. He has suffered your committing 1,000 ugly offenses and abominations against him, and this suffering wasn't enough for him to cease looking at you. Is it too much to ask you to turn your eyes from these exterior things in order to look at him sometimes? Note that in inviting us to represent Christ as close to us, Theresa is not really asking us to imagine Christ. She's inviting us to become aware of his presence in an attentive way. It is not an active thinking about or imagining Christ. I'm not asking you now that you think about him or that you draw out a lot of concepts or make long and subtle reflections with your intellect. I'm not asking you to do anything more than to look at him. So this is the foundation of her prayer teaching in the Way of Perfection. Presence. So she's building on what Francisco de Osuna writes about recollection in the third spiritual alphabet, which is this book that really affected her in her way of prayer, about not thinking in prayer. She wants to fill that out more with presence. You're being present to God even though you're not thinking. That's the Way of Perfection. But there are three things we need besides prayer. We must prepare the soil so that we can be fertile ground for such prayer. And this fertile ground is prepared by faithful growth in what Theresa considers three essential virtues that she highlights from the Carmelite constitutions that she wrote for her nuns. The first of these is love for one another. The second is detachment from all created things. The third is humility, which, even though I speak of it last, is the main practice and embraces all the others. If our efforts at praying are not accompanied by our efforts at transforming our lives more generally, we simply cannot experience real growth in authentic prayer, and we cannot prepare ourselves for the gift of contemplation. So I'm taking this from a wonderful book by Mark O'Keefe, who is a Benedictine monk. He has a lot of good things to say. He's going to guide us in these next few slides. But I wanted to draw your attention at the bottom of this slide to what Terry says in Way of Perfection, chapter 4, paragraph 2. Prayer and comfortable living are incompatible. This is a commentary on the fact that we need love of neighbor, detachment, and humility to grow in prayer. She is not imagining comfortable living as just an easy a recliner or a nice comfy couch. She's imagining life that is comfortable for the ego. That is, my assumptions aren't challenged. I don't criticize myself. I don't have any self-knowledge. I don't become aware of my own blind spots and my own ego desires and my own attachments. And it is more comfortable to generally maybe not be so loving towards some people. If you've tried to love somebody, you know that can really challenge your sense of comfort. So that's a general comment on all three of these virtues that we're going to go through. But also, trust in the great goodness of God, who never fails to help anyone who is determined to give up everything for him, to be occupied in prayer. So all of this is based on, yes, there's that general statement, prayer and comfortable living are incompatible, but that is even based on the goodness of God, trusting in the goodness of God. O'Keefe writes, love of neighbor purifies or corrects our relationships with others. Detachment makes right our relationship with things of this world, and humility rectifies our relationship with ourselves. Or to look at them from another perspective, our self-seeking and egoism are overcome by growth and love of neighbor. Our distraction and enslavement are uprooted by detachment. And our delusions about ourselves and about our true status before God are vanquished by humility. So very quickly, each one. Love of neighbor. It is precisely the daily effort to love the people whom God sends into our lives each day, unselfishly and in deed, that liberates our freedom to love and to give ourselves to God completely, as divine union requires. So she's trying to be very concrete here. The people that you run across in a day, those are the people God sends you to love. So yes, that person I was talking about earlier, when I'm on 495 and they cut me off, that person. My kids, my family, my friends, the people I see as I'm commuting to work, the people that are in the grocery store, those are the people God calls us to love. O'Keefe says, prayer cannot be separated from the down-to-earth demands of loving. So imagine Terry is on the road to Burgos in these muddy conditions. The wagons are getting stuck. She is sick to death. She's got this terrible sore throat. And there's one sister chatting in her ear, complaining maybe about the whole thing. Those situations. Loving the chatty sister. Loving maybe the guys who are out trying to get the wagons out of the mud. You know, loving the people who, even when you get to Burgos and they are a dead set against you, the mayor and the bishop don't want you there, loving them too. There is nothing, she writes, there is nothing annoying that is not suffered easily by those who love one another. A thing would have to be extremely annoying before causing any displeasure. So she knows. It's not like she's a human being. We run across annoying people all the time. Can we, in a very good sense, suffer them? In other words, be patient with people that we find mildly to greatly annoying. Just a very practical way to put into practice love of neighbor. Detachment. The whole point is that we should give ourselves to God with complete determination. And we should empty the soul in such a way that he can store things there or take them away as though it were his own property. And since he doesn't force our will, he takes what we give him, but he doesn't give himself completely until we give ourselves completely. Now, a lot of mystics say something similar. Give yourself totally to God, who gives God's self totally to you. In fact, that's almost the same exact words that St. Francis of Assisi uses. Give yourself to God. So this means, if we're to take what we said earlier, detachment means detachment from the things of this world. So your possessions. And maybe more generally, the opinion people have about you, and certain job titles or degrees or education or opinions. So not just physical, tangible things, but some intangible things as well. Now, let us talk about the detachment we ought to have. For detachment, if it is practiced with perfection, includes everything. I say it includes everything because if we embrace the Creator and care not at all for the whole of his creation, his majesty will infuse the virtues. For Theresa, detachment is nothing else than the necessary condition for truly loving God. Do you think it is possible for a person who really loves God to love vanities? No, indeed, he cannot. Nor can he love riches or worldly things or delights or honors or strife or envy. I'm willing to bet, just because we're human, I say, what is one of your attachments? Something very easily comes to mind. And I would define an attachment as that thing I think I need to be happy. I need that. And Terry's saying, maybe you don't. Maybe you don't need that. In fact, that energy you're putting into getting that attachment, put that into loving God. That's detachment. So it's a positive virtue. The soul detaches to be consumed with God, to be able to give oneself wholly to God without restraint. So you can almost look at it as an attachment as something holding you back from truly loving. And humility. Humility is necessary where the main occupation is prayer. It is so essential, it may be the one practice that contains love of neighbor and detachment. One should always take the lowest place. For this is what the Lord told us to do and taught us indeed. Prepare yourself so that God may lead you along this path if he so desires. When he doesn't, you can practice humility, which is to consider yourself lucky to serve the servants of the Lord and praise his majesty, because he brought you among them and drew you away from the devils in hell, where you deserve to be a slave of these devils. So she's still, in the 16th century. But she's trying to say there, don't worry about where others are on the journey. And if you're not as far along as you want to be, that's a great time to practice humility. Accept yourself as you are. That's what she's saying. Accept God in you and that God accepts you as you are, just as you are. Doesn't mean you will stay this way. You will grow, but it starts with, I am where I am and that's okay. And I trust in God, that God will lead me where I need to be. While we can develop a strong habit of prayer and dispose ourselves for yet deeper prayer, true contemplation can only be given to us by God. The highest level of prayer, contemplation, is a gift. Our attitude then must be humility, trusting that God will dispose all things, including our advance into deeper forms of prayer for our own good. So there may be times, remember, Terry says, keep praying, keep praying, keep praying. There may be times when it feels like it's going nowhere. Don't feel you, God. Don't see you. Don't know what's going on. I keep showing up. I'm doing my part. I'm present. Where are you? That's a good time to practice humility, meaning trusting that God knows what God is doing. Trusting that God will lead me where I need to go. But for Terry, and this we'll get into more next week with the interior castle, humility means self-knowledge. It means being aware of our blind spots, coming to a truth about ourselves, coming to see how we really are in God's sight. And this is an odd virtue because it also comes when you start praying. You only sort of get self-knowledge when you start praying. It's almost like it's a gift that keeps on giving. In fact, it's the one guaranteed gift. You will get self-knowledge when you pray. When you're not just when you're saying prayers, not just when you're imagining Jesus, not just when you're out in nature or reading books, but that silent prayer we've been talking about, Nopen Sarnata, presence. When you do that, self-knowledge comes. And all I can say is trust me, because I've experienced it. One of the biggest gifts is God showing you a little bit more about yourself than you realized. You thought maybe, oh, I'm clearly doing this one occupation, this one task, I'm volunteering at this soup kitchen out of love for the poor. And then you're in prayer and God says, no, you're doing that because you want people to think you're a saint. You're doing that because you want to look good. And oddly, and this has just been my experience, oddly, in prayer, it's not experienced as a criticism. It's not experienced as something bad. It's a truth you rejoice to know. Oh, yeah, I do that just so I can look good before others. How about that? It doesn't destroy you, because it's like, on the one hand, God is revealing these things to you, and with the other hand, God is holding you close, drawing you in deeper, and affirming, you're good, I love you. Yeah, it's silly that you do this, but I love you and you're good. It's almost like the best of both worlds. Just one hand wipes away our illusions, and the other hand wipes away our tears. We come to our questions now. How do you practice prayer? How can you incorporate more time for no pensar nada into your prayer? What insight from Theresa about loving neighbor, detachment, or humility will you take to deepen your prayer life? And how has the story of her foundations helped you? How does it help you? And again, I've only shared a very little bit. My great hope is that tonight you will go buy a copy of that book and read it, because it is so much fun. So I turn you over to Lisa, and you'll go into your groups, and hopefully we'll have a few more minutes after your groups for some question and answer. Welcome back, everybody.
Thank you.
Hope you had some good discussion.
Mhm.
So we just wanted to open it up at the end here. If you had any questions or comments you wanted to share, and make a space for that. So yeah, anything you wanted to say or any questions you wanted to ask me, go right ahead. And if you're not inclined to speak in the group, you can certainly put it in the chat and we'll read it there, if that's easier for some.
LJ, two things from me.
Mhm.
One is, well, three things. One, thank you so much. This is both
Sure.
sessions so far have been just wonderful. So I appreciate what you're doing for us. And the breakout sessions, both weeks have been just really exciting and electric discussions. So I've been happy to have the opportunity to go deeper with some of my fellows. And then I have a question. I had a question last week about books. My question this week is about, you mentioned some of the troubles that Theresa had with the authorities, whether they were religious or secular. I suspect troubles with men mostly, because at the time she probably struggled with that sort of stuff. I know that at the beginning of the interior castle, she had a note that says, "Oh, I'm just a silly woman, so anything I say might be wrong." And she was kind of protecting herself in case, they came at her. But can you speak a little to the nature of maybe some of the troubles she did have with men or with just a secular or religious authority?
Sure. So early on, the trouble was she's having these experiences, like the transverberation, the angel she saw in a vision piercing her with the arrow. And
Believer.
it was a practice in that time for nuns to go to a priest for confession, but also for spiritual direction. So it was almost kind of combined into one. And she'd tell them about these experiences. And many times the confessors, who were learned priests, said, no, this is not right. These are coming from the devil. And some of them would get together in groups to have like discussions, because they thought she was such a troublesome directee. And so she would more or less fire these confessors and move on to another one, because she didn't like what they had to say. And even one confessor wanted her to thumb her nose at the visions she was having, which would have been the 16th century Spanish equivalent of giving the vision the finger. Okay. And she said, I'm going to put it in our language. She thought, I can't give the finger to Jesus. And Jesus in a vision says, where it's okay, tell them you did it and it's okay, but tell them you're not going to do it again. So just they didn't believe her. And it took her, I think, like 6 or 7, she cycled through 6 or 7 confessors to get someone who said, no, what you're experiencing is genuine, just don't stop praying. So that's one of the major problems she had. And then when she started to found convents and monasteries, even the leadership of the Carmelites turned against her. It was a combination of, and this is also true of like bishops and mayors of certain cities. A new convent comes into a city. It's a drain on the local economy because the nuns, especially her nuns, who weren't going to rely on a rich patron, were just going to ask for any alms that the local people could give them, and were satisfied to live in poverty. That was a strongly, almost despised by leadership, by mayors of cities and by bishops especially, because they wanted the people in their, the Bishop of Toledo wanted the people of Toledo to give him money, to give his local. It does at some point come down to money, guys. So there is that, and she puts those kinds of expressions in all of her works. I'm just a silly woman. I'm just a stupid woman. She puts them in so frequently that some scholars, and I'm of the same opinion as these scholars, I think she was gaming the system. I think she was, excuse me, I think she was intentionally saying those things so that the male-run Inquisition, which was in its heyday, Spanish Inquisition, they were active and looking for people to condemn. She put that in there, yes, as a protection, but it almost like she was playing the game so that her works would get published. And even playing that game, the book of her life almost wasn't published. There was a list of an index of forbidden books that, if you're Catholic, the index of forbidden books was only gotten rid of this last century, by the way. So a few hundred years they just kept adding books to this index of just don't read these kinds of books. And some of her books almost made it on there. In fact, the Life did, and then it was taken off. So she had to kind of play some of those games, and yet none of these men really knew what they were getting involved with whenever Terry came to town. And it's not for nothing that Peter of Alcantara and John of the Cross, they didn't try and control Theresa. They met her as equals, only because they were humble. That's the real equality there. It's not like they were trying to manipulate her or get one over on her. But when Terry came into town, she was kind of like the star, but also people deferred to her, or they were actively against her. John of the Cross was someone that would just met her. No, Terry, you're my friend, and I'm going to tell you where I think you're wrong. I still love you, but so she could never, quite figure out what to do with him. But most people couldn't figure out what to do with her. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Good question. Any other questions?
Hi, I'm Ben.
Hi, Ben.
I was telling the group I was with Hilaire and Kathleen and Barbara, and it was just such a joy to hear their experiences and ideas. And I just have a notebook full of quotes, and I guess the quote that I'll be leaving with so many quotes, but just a quote I shared with my group, it's just so me. It's so simple, but I guess that's truth is just so simple. Not easy, but simple. And I love this quote. It is precisely the daily effort to love the people whom God sends into our lives each day And then I loved, LJ, what you said. Those are the people to love. Those right there, to your right and the left, the one walking toward you, the ones sitting on the bus beside you that you don't even talk to,
Yeah.
you won't ever talk to. Those are the people to love. I just found that, again, it's so simple. It's not easy, but it is such a simple truth. And I just thought it's beautiful. So thank you.
Sure. Yeah, I wonder, how can I ride the metro often. How do I love the people on the metro? You know, I guess it's maybe just smiling and having a certain presence about you, right? And not, there is something too, and this is what I meant by holiness is what's truly effective, or part of what I meant by it. And it's a line I get from another Carmelite named Ruth Burroughs. And she's writing about that and describing Theresa of Avila. But part of that means that when I am looking at somebody on the metro, I'm not looking at them with disdain or even distraction. But there's this person in front of me, I may never know their name. And you know how she was talking about prayers, looking at Christ? You might think of loving your neighbor as kind of bringing that same dynamic. Looking, gazing at someone, not staring. that can quickly take things in another direction, at least on the metro or the bus. But you know, gazing at somebody and with the intention to love them, that may be all that we can do. But yeah, Ben, as you said, that right there, that particular person right there, who may be smelly or maybe not attractive to you, or you might have all these judgments form about this person before you ever even know their name, right? Wiping those away. That is also a part of, that's why those three virtues kind of are one and the same. They're all connected, because to love someone like that, you do need detachment and humility. Humility to recognize I have all these biases about this person, but also detachment from those same biases to truly love that person. So it's all connected. Yeah. Thanks for sharing. Yeah, I love that line too.
Okay, now you talk.
I have a question, clarification
Sure.
to what you had said before. So in reading all of this, those people in power understood that she may have actually had this experience, but they want to negate it because they don't want to give her any, like they think maybe she did see an angel or maybe XYZ did happen, but you know, thumb your nose at it because I don't want to lose any power to her.
That
Or
could have been
we
their
have no way
intention.
to know.
We only know what Terry reported in her books and in her letters. We have a lot of her letters. And the only thing she reports in her books and letters is that they were convinced it was the devil.
Oh, okay.
That they were convinced these aren't visions from God you're getting. These are visions from the devil. Yeah. So I remember that line I shared. I don't fear Satan. I fear more those who fear Satan, because they're so focused on the devil. And even in her own writing, she'll bring up the devil often. But there was a fanatical focus on Satan, even more than in some fundamentalist Christian communities today. It just, everything was the devil. It's like, well, that's not really our religion. It's more about God, right? In fact, it's a lot more about God.
I
Yeah,
see.
you got to be aware of illusions and you know.
But that's what drove the Inquisition.
That's exactly right, Russ. That's exactly right. That's what drove the Inquisition. This excuse me, this projection of evil in the other.
Mhm.
See, I suggest that that's the opposite of loving our neighbor.
Beautiful.
I think loving our neighbor is putting on the mind of Christ, looking at him through spiritual eyes and seeing the Christ in him.
Yeah. Yeah. You got it right.
That's
Yeah.
exactly what they weren't doing. That's the exact opposite.
So Terry and her friend John, John of the Cross, were very aware that there was a problem in 16th century Spain of bad spiritual directors because they would get learning. They had a lot of learning and education, but they didn't have the experience. They weren't necessarily praying. And in fact, not too long
Humility,
before
and
Teresa
neither
and
was
John are active, there's not just the Inquisition is active, but there are heresies or perceived heresies about. So the Spanish Inquisition is actively looking for these kinds of things, actively looking for heretics, people who are wrong, right? So when you have that mindset, yeah, it's not going to be, you're going to see the devil where the devil's not. Yeah.
Yeah, I see it a lot like the McCarthy era. They were seeing
Yeah.
devils under the bushes, like they were seeing communists under the bushes in the 50s.
Yep.
Yeah.
Got it.
The same dynamic. Yeah. Yeah. Good points, everybody. Thank you. Any final question before we head out for the night? All right. I turn it back to you, Lisa.
We'll see
LJ,
you
thank
soon.
you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
will-
you.
See y'all next
My
week.
pleasure. I
Beautiful.
love being here. Thank you, guys.